That is school funding. My name is Erica Breunlin, and I cover education for the Colorado Sun. The Colorado Sun is a member of the Trust Project, and you can see our commitment to trusted journalism at coloradosun.com/ethics. You know, when some people open up a school finance story, their eyes glaze over. Others, like me and our esteemed panelists tonight, don't think it's a party unless we're talking about mill levy overrides and per pupil funding. But regardless, I think it's critical that we all care about school funding because our schools are really the backbone of this state and our future. Tonight, we're going to go through the past, present, and future of education funding in Colorado as much as we can get through in an hour. We have a lot of ground to cover about school funding and decisions in the past that have led us to the state of school funding currently. We also want to look at if there are any levers Colorado could pull in the future to increase school funding. Now, before I introduce our panelists, I want to thank our event sponsor tonight. Thank you to the Colorado Education Association. I also plan to do a quick School Finance 101 session with all of you, but we will first run through our panelists. Joining us tonight is Colorado House Speaker Julie McCluskey, a Dillon Democrat, who was one of the driving forces behind the state's new school funding formula last year. Speaker McCluskey has been a state representative since 2018, and her roles inside the Capitol have included chair of the Legislative Interim Committee on School Finance, as well as chair of the Joint Budget Committee. Before her time in office, Speaker McCluskey worked in the Summit County School District for more than a dozen years. Also joining us is State Senator Barbara Kirkmeyer, a Brighton Republican and a member of the JBC. Senator Kirkmeyer was elected in 2020. Before that, she was a longtime Weld County Commissioner and also was appointed acting executive director of the Department of Local Affairs under former Governor Bill Owens. Before her career in public services, Senator Kirkmeyer co-owned and operated a dairy farm and was a small business owner. And representing Colorado school districts this evening is Chuck Carpenter, who is Chief Financial Officer of Colorado's largest school district, Denver Public Schools. Chuck has worked for DPS in a variety of roles since 2008, and he took over as CFO of the district in 2021. He was also appointed chair of Colorado's Public School Finance Task Force in 23, which was created by the legislature and looked at how Colorado could fund its schools better. Before coming to DPS, Chuck taught elementary school in rural Louisiana as a part of Teach for America. And rounding out our panel is Kate Bartlett, Superintendent of Lake County School District in Leadville. Kate was named Superintendent of Lake County School District last year, and she previously worked for the district from 2010 to 2019, including as the district CFO. Kate's career has also included working under the Colorado Department of Education as the Turnaround Program Manager, the Executive Director of School Operations, the Associate Director of the School Finance Project, and as a Project Manager for grants. So I am in good hands tonight with the experts that we need to hear from. Before we dive into our questions, I want to run through a quick School Finance 101 session, just so we can set the table with some major developments that have happened in school finance over the past year. Now, I know I have a lot of teachers out in the audience who are yelling at me, wondering why so many words are on a screen. I'm a writer, I love words, but we are gonna zip right through these points. So these are just some cliff notes on Colorado school funding and some of the developments we've seen in recent years. First, last year was a landmark year for Colorado school funding. We saw the state adopt House Bill 1448, a brand new school finance formula, the first big change to the school funding formula in 3 decades. We also saw state lawmakers commit to paying off the budget stabilization factor. That, of course, is this great recession era accounting tool that was used to help budget the state budget in a time of crisis and really did end up stripping districts of necessary money, $10 billion total over 14 years. Things got a little gloomier this year when we found ourselves facing a state budget deficit of $1.2 million, largely driven by rising costs in Medicaid. That prompted lawmakers to have to make some tough decisions and really try to figure out how to cut programs and agencies statewide. They did, however, really commit to protecting funding for K-12 schools. So the total budget for this year's K-12 school system is more than $10 billion. Most of our districts will see an increase in school funding from what they received during the current year, but some will be, quote, held harmless, meaning that they will receive at least as much money next year, as what they received for the current school year. Now, lawmakers did have to scale back on how much they'll give schools next year through our new school finance formula. So districts will get about $16 million less than what they would have gotten if House Bill 1448 was implemented originally as designed. And lawmakers are still figuring out what school finance is going to look like for this next year. That clock on the legislative session is winding down. We have House Bill 1320, the School Finance Act, that is currently making its way through the Capitol and will next be debated tomorrow. Of course, we also know that based on the results of 2 adequacy studies, the state is underfunding education by between $3.5 billion and $4.1 billion. Very eye-popping figures, but many education experts agree that we can build a path to ultimately adequately fund our schools at some point. That was my school finance lesson. I hope I aced it. We're going to dive right into questions now, and we're going to start with you, Madam Speaker. So you've been involved in school finance for several years. I know this is something that really has a lot of personal meaning to you. You were one of the lead architects of House Bill 1448, which created this new formula after 30 years. Now, this new formula is intended to better fund school districts based on student needs rather than district needs, and really focuses on giving districts more money for their high needs students, also focuses on giving rural school districts more money. My question to you is, why did it take Colorado so long to adopt a new school funding formula, especially as we're seeing needs in school escalate? You know, schools are feeding kids, they're addressing their mental health, they're helping families beyond the classroom. Why did it take 3 decades to get a new funding formula in place?
Wow, great question, Erica. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. And I'm really delighted to be here with Senator Kirkmeyer, the amazing Chuck Carpenter, and Kate Bartlett. It's a great team, and thanks for the conversation. You know, I started working in public schools in 2004, and there were calls back then for additional funding, shifts in funding to help address the needs that districts were tackling. I think that in 2017, the legislature, I was not then elected, launched an interim school finance formula committee, a bipartisan group, to tackle this exact issue, because I think over the years, the original formula passed in 1994 had generally met the needs of our school districts, but questions around both equity and adequacy were bubbling up. And when the Great Recession hit, and thank you for the School Finance 101, and the budget stabilization factor implemented as a tool during that time to help the state balance its budget, that it became much more acute that we needed to address the adequacy of funding in our public schools. I think what came from that 2017 interim committee and the committees, we had another one in 18, another one in 19. The bipartisan work of that group helped us get to the point where we are now. So we had senators and representatives talking about how do we create a student-centered funding formula. Both sides of the aisle agreed on that, and it was a great way for us to establish a common value, a common principle about what needed to happen next. We identified the challenges that exist for at-risk, special education, gifted and talented, English language learners. We also acknowledged the challenges of rural, small, and remote school districts. And it was through the work of that committee and then ultimately the public school finance group that Chuck Carpenter chaired that brought forward a recommendation to the legislature last year. And I give a lot of credit to the many members of those committees before, the committee that Chuck led, that helped us ultimately get to a place where we could all support a finance formula that really is putting us on a path to a more equitable and hopefully adequate funding approach for our districts.
And on that note, so yes, Chuck, you chaired the Public School Finance Task Force, and you put forth all these recommendations really designed to inform lawmakers on how to rethink about the state school funding formula and how we could improve our school funding formula. So bring us inside what that work of this task force looked like and the top recommendations that you wanted to impress upon lawmakers.
Well, thank you, Erica. It's good to be here with the other folks on the committee, and I'm proud to represent the folks that were on that committee on the Public School Task Force with me. It wasn't just me, it was a diverse group of people really from all over the state and a lot of different interests, bipartisan. And I think, if we go another 30 years before a group like that comes together, or the legislature decides to update the school funding formula, that will be, that'll be a missed opportunity. I think we had 30 years of time between the last school finance formula update, and we had a lot of task force that came before us and a lot of recommendations. And so the path was really paved for us to put the recommendations together. But I think, where there was a lot of agreement was that we need to put more resources to the student needs that are not succeeding in public schools at the same rate. And so that's largely students in poverty. It's largely students learning English and students that qualify for special education. And I think that the group almost had unanimous agreement that those areas need additional funding. So there wasn't really, and this is probably why the group worked and was able to come forward with the recommendations, because we generally agreed on those principles, that we need to put more money into those areas. Those are the students that aren't achieving at the highest rates. And then I think, where there were probably disagreements, it was sort of on the very technical areas, like, how much should we fund at risk versus special education? Should ELL, as it does now, only go for 5 years, or should it go for the entire 12 years of when you're a student in K-12, I guess 13 years. So I think the group had a lot of agreement. I think there was a lot of consensus in K-12 that there does need to be more resources put in those particular areas. And so we were, because of that sort of common ground, because of the work before us, we had an opportunity to bring a recommendation to the legislature, and the legislature had to act too. And I think they deserve a lot of credit for stakeholding and for putting a coalition together that could actually get that accomplished.
Now, briefly, House Speaker McCluskey, can you walk us through how 1448 differs from the 1990 school finance formula, and why it's so important to prioritize focusing on student needs and funding student needs over district characteristics? Oh, and if you can just put your microphone back on, please.
I didn't take it off. Oh, shucks.
Oh,
Can you hear me now?
I apologize. That was on our end. We can hear you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. The approach to a student-centered funding formula helps us ensure that a school that has a larger population of kids from low socioeconomic backgrounds, or a larger population of special education or English language learners is getting additional funding. Those dollars help keep class sizes smaller, helps provide for additional professional support, maybe provides for additional professional development or training, or curriculum that helps better address the needs of those students. And the desire to help craft a formula that better addresses the need to support academic achievement was always at the heart of the work that we were doing. I think this shift, while it may be new to the funding formula and a change after 30 years, I don't know of a teacher or a principal that doesn't recognize that our students show up with different needs. And, I think really embraced the idea that we need additional resources for kids who show up on with maybe not the same background or the same opportunities, and simply need additional help to learn and grow as a student.
Now, I want to take us down to the school level, because I think it can get really easy to get lost in a lot of these figures that float around the Capitol. You hear the figure $10 billion funding education, and it's just this enormous figure. And yet we also know that we are underfunding our schools by $3.5 billion to $4.1 billion. And we also know that for 14 years, schools endured state funding cuts through the budget stabilization factor totaling $10 billion. Kate and Chuck, I'm really hoping you guys can walk us through what these funding cuts from the budget stabilization factor, that's a tricky one, what those cuts meant for your schools. What challenges did they create for staff and students, and what tough decisions did they force your districts to make? Kate, let's first hear from you.
Thanks, Erica. I think that if you think about the cumulative impact of everything you're talking about, what happens over time is it just changes the water that you're swimming in, and you start to think that certain things are just normal. And I think that especially in small rurals and rural resort communities, the reality is starting to be put in front of our faces in a way that's more urgent over the past couple of years, I would say. So, to give you a couple of examples, our starting teacher salary right now is $43,000. So that means if you take 30% of that teacher's monthly income, that's about $1,100. That is virtually impossible to find a place to live in Leadville, Colorado, or any mountain town for $1,100. So whereas a couple of years, 5, 10 years ago, we were sort of threading that needle, it is now becoming harder and harder. We offered a teacher a job a couple of weeks ago, and she has a master's degree, and our offer was $57,000. And we thought, we're crushing it. This is great. And then she got a counter offer from her Front Range district for $80,000. So she turned us down. So, those realities are just starting to be more stark for us. And factors that we sort of managed for a long time are just getting harder to manage. I think for small rurals, there are other factors. Chuck and I operate in vastly different contexts, and he has challenges that are huge. And I have challenges that are small, but to me, they're huge. Like the fact that I have to spend $75,000 to $100,000 a year on snow removal. That's a real number for me. So I think the economies of scale question has gotten really tricky. And we've gotten to a place where we cannot do our work without seeking other funding sources. So competitive grants are a great example. And another example is going to our voters. So we went to our voters in November. Speaker McCluskey helped us, knocked doors with us, and appreciate that. But that was where we were. And if we hadn't passed that mill levy override, we would be cutting staff right now and freezing pay. So those are some examples from our neck of the mountains.
Just really, really tough realities. Chuck, what about you here on the Front Range in Denver? What have these funding cuts over 14 years meant for DPS, the challenges that they create for staff, for students, and the tough decisions you have to make as a district administrator?
I think what my colleague Kate said very, very well is that, you solve for these things in the moment when you have to solve for them, and they're sort of they have an emergency type feeling, and you have to do the thing, and then you do it, and then that just becomes normal. And if I think back to, I think 2010 was the first year that we had the budget stabilization factor. We basically froze pay that year, and then we had just minimal increases for the following several years. And then you sort of have another budget problem. You say, all right, well, we're going to cut. We usually have 3 custodians at this high school. We're going to go to 2. And then you say, okay, well, we usually renew our curriculum every 6 years. We're going to now go and do it every 8 years. And yes, I know we should probably replace that parking lot, but we're not going to. And this roof needs repaired or replaced entirely, but we're just not going to do it. And so, over the years, you just make all of these small concessions. And I think if you were to look back and say, well, what if we didn't make all those concessions? It would look the schools that kids walk into would look a lot different. The classrooms they look into a lot different. The pay for the folks, not just teachers, but everybody would look a lot different. And so I think the cumulative effect of it, as Kate spoke to, is really meaningful. And that's how you get to the point where you ever have an adequacy study that shows, what that did.
Now I want to turn to House Bill 1320, which will be discussed tomorrow and is our School Finance Act. Before that, however, I want to bring the conversation to you, Senator Kirkmeyer. I know that as a member of the JBC, you have been very vocal throughout this legislative session with concerns that Colorado simply does not have the money to fund the new school finance formula 1448 as it was designed. At this, almost 11th hour in the legislative session, do you believe that we have the money to fund 1448?
Yes, actually I do. Thank you very much for the question, and thank you for allowing me onto the panel. I'm just going to back up just a minute though and say I feel very fortunate. You know, when I came into the Senate, I was put on the Education Committee and I was able to serve with Senator Zenzinger and Senator Lundeen. And then I was the vice chair of the Public School Finance Interim Committee with Speaker McCluskey. So I think I had great learning ground there from some of the, you know, some great mentors and folks who understood school finance. And I'm just going to say the amount of information and the amount of knowledge that I was able to garner from those three folks has been tremendous, and it's been great. So I just want to say thank you on that, because Speaker McCluskey certainly is one of the folks who, when you talk school finance, you have to talk Speaker McCluskey, and it used to be Senator Zenzinger and Senator Lundeen. So appreciate everything that they have done to enhance school finance and what they've done with regard to their formulas. I mean, I actually voted for 1448, but my concern this year is we're in a structural deficit, and it's been occurring over the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, quite frankly, we've been spending more than we've been bringing in, and that's not good. That just doesn't work. So want to make sure, you know, when we got to the budget stabilization factor, in fact, it was in 2023 in that School Finance Act, working with Senator Zenzinger and Senator Lundeen, that we were able in a Senate committee to say, look, we can't get rid of the budget stabilization factor this year, but we can get close. But we put in that School Finance Act that we would eliminate it in 2024. And at that time, Senator Zenzinger and I both were on the Joint Budget Committee, so we knew we could do it. And that was our goal. We can't, you know, we cannot ever go back to a budget stabilization factor. And I would say within the Joint Budget Committee, this is probably, and I've heard Senator Bridges say this a few times as well, this is probably one of the strongest joint budget committees when it comes to funding school finance that at least that he talks about. So I'm going to just agree with him that, you know, that's our number one priority. There is no crisis of priority here. We are very dead set on at the Joint Budget Committee that we are not going back to a budget stabilization factor. So this year on the Joint Budget Committee, when, you know, we're faced with making cuts, and we are, and we're still in a structural deficit, it's not like something that's going to be cured in a year. We looked through, and there was a requirement in 1448 that we put together a sustainability plan and look at everything that is out there. So our staff at the Joint Budget Committee did put together that sustainability plan and looked at what the governor's request was with his budget request come November, and even in January, looked at 1448, looked at the old formula just to say, how do we ensure that we can sustain our funding and not return to a budget stabilization factor? How do we ensure to stabilize the state education fund? Because, you know, when we're bringing in 1.2 billion into a state education fund, but we're spending 1.5 billion out of it because of some of the dollars that we've had, you know, since 2020 that have gone into that fund, that's just not sustainable. And we need to make sure on the Joint Budget Committee to ensure that we are on this path of sustainability. So this year at the Joint Budget Committee, we actually voted to put an additional $150 million of general fund into total program and into the fund, just to make sure, again, that we were stabilizing the state education fund and that we could be assured that we would have the dollars that are needed to fund a 1448. As I would tell Senator Lundeen, because I know he's he was on Senate Bill or House Bill 1448. He's also on House Bill 1320. I said, look, it's my job at the Joint Budget Committee to ensure that we can fund those bills that we're passing over across the street, and to, again, to ensure that we don't go back to a stabilization budget factor. So I think we're in a pretty good position, and I think we've got a strong Joint Budget Committee that is willing to support and make sure that we fund education as our top priority when it comes to the budget.
Thank you, Senator Kirkmeyer. I want to move us now into talking about House Bill 1320, which is, of course, the current School Finance Act that lawmakers are taking a look at. House Speaker McCluskey, you are one of the key sponsors of this bill. It's a bipartisan piece of legislation. It does look a little different from how 1448 would have originally rolled out. including that this bill says that the new school funding formula, instead of being rolled out over 6 years, will move to 7 years. Walk us through the nuts and bolts of this proposal and the input that you gathered from school district leaders and teachers in trying to craft this proposal.
You know, the governor did come forward with a budget proposal in November, and my thanks to Senator Kirkmeyer and our Joint Budget Committee for the extraordinary work they've done this year in helping us balance to a $1.2 billion deficit. It was a tremendous lift, and we're in a very solid, sustainable place because of their good work. The governor's budget proposal for schools eliminated the averaging tool that has been used in our funding formula to help stabilize school funding in a declining student enrollment environment. We heard from districts all across the state, large and small, urban and rural, that eliminating, going from 4-year averaging, which was what we had proposed in 1448, to 0 was a shock to the system that they simply couldn't bear. And we had to look at the 1448 proposal from last year to see what else could we do? How could we be flexible in this moment, recognizing the budget pressures we're facing? So as you've noted, we extended the runway for implementation of 1448 from 6 years to 7 years. We have put some safeguards in place, maintaining the triggers should there be a recession, a significant economic downturn, to stop the implementation of the new formula and hold our funding flat, or at least at the level that we are at with implementation. We have established that, you know, based on how much more money we can put next year towards our schools, we'll balance that with that averaging factor. Again, thinking about how do we maintain stable funding for our schools and the confidence that they will not see the kind of impact that was originally proposed in November. I'd, you know, also like to offer that with a 15% additional funding for our schools this year, we are seeing all but 21 school districts get new money over 24-25. Really grateful for the ways that we have worked with rural schools and our urban, suburban districts in trying to make sure that we can move forward with the new formula at a slightly lower rate, also a longer runway, just to make sure that we are on a sustainable path. We've done a lot of modeling with our partners in the governor's office to really explore what could be the impacts over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. You know, I certainly don't want to see 1448, a new school finance funding approach, be the reason that our schools are having to consider a budget stabilization factor ever again, right? We need to do this in a really smart, thoughtful way. And I think for the next few years, as we have modeled, we may need to pause or adjust 1448, and we will do that in a responsible way. I think our school districts understand that. They did great work with us this year in trying to find the right place for us to land where they saw additional funding, which was ever so important, and still understood that we couldn't do everything all at once.
I want to little. My politics colleague Brian Easton recently reported JBC Chair Senator Jeff Bridges saying that next year is going to be very bad. The cuts will be much more deep and much more painful. And now Brian also reported that unless lawmakers can come up with even larger funding increases in the coming years, the state won't be able to sustain the spending levels called for in the new formula without depleting the state education fund. I know Senator Kirkmeyer, you raised some concerns about maintaining the reserves in the state education fund. I know that you, Madam Speaker, brought up the need to potentially tweak or adjust 1448 in the future, depending on what revenue looks like. Can you both talk to me about whether you have concerns about sustainability and whether we can continue giving 1448 life, you know, in the long term?
I can go first on that if you'd like. So I think whether it's 1448 or 1320, and I appreciate what Speaker McCluskey was saying, that instead of an 18% increase, it would be a 15% increase. That does help. And then, you know, extending the runway, that does help as well. I think, you know, we're going to have to be creative but we're also going to have to, again, identify priorities. I've said this year, there's been times when I was looking at the governor's budget request and felt like there was a crisis of priorities there. Because the governor's first budget request came in and it would have actually cut education, which no one on the Joint Budget Committee found acceptable. So we worked again in working with the governor's office to make sure that we put in that additional $150 million. I think there are other things that have happened though, just even in the past year, that people need to also think about as we were like, how do we ensure that the funding is there? And that is in those tax measures, those property tax measures that we passed. One of the most important things that we did, and so we started this in Senate Bill 233 at the end of the 24 session, and then Speaker McCluskey and I carried the bill in the special session that decoupled the property tax assessment rate for schools, so that we would be ensured again that working with the schools, working with, it happened in the past with mill levies and those types of things, that mill levy would still be up there and the assessment rate would be decoupled, and it would be a higher assessment rate with regard to school property taxes versus than it was the residential rate in counties and municipalities, special districts, et cetera. So that was a big deal. And I think it kind of got brushed over, but it was a big deal to ensure that the school district funding was still coming in and it was commensurate. Again, worked with and can't underscore the contribution that that Director Ferrandino made. He's with the Office of State Planning and Budget to really work through that process to decouple the assessment rate for residential for school districts to ensure that we would still have that funding coming in. Because right now, as it sits in our budget between Medicaid and public school education funding, that's about 68 to 69% of our general fund operating costs. So that's why it starts bringing up concerns when we're in a structural deficit. I mean, we've done a lot of things just this year. Our job this year was to kind of glide into next year, but next year is still going to be a tough year and we're going to have to make some tough cuts. But hopefully the all of our friends across the street, because the Joint Budget Committee is on the other side of Colfax, and that's where we meet. I hope hopefully our other 94 colleagues understand that we were serious when we said we're going to have to start making cuts and they're going to have to be in certain programs. And everybody, just like when we eliminated the budget stabilization factor, everybody, all 100 legislators need to understand we need to prioritize education and we're going to have to fund Medicaid providers and do those increases there. I think they're starting to learn that. I don't know, over in the Senate, I'm not sure about the House. I'm not in the House. But over in the Senate, we've been drilling it into them that, we can't be creating new programs. I don't care if it's only $140,000. That's $140,000 that we're going to need next year. I mean, things of that nature. So I think my colleagues, at least in the Senate, are starting to understand next year is still a cutting year. We can't keep increasing and priorities have to be set. Is it going to be education for everybody? Because I know it is for the Joint Budget Committee. I know it is for Speaker McCluskey. But is it going to be for everybody? Education, Medicaid provider rates, we've got higher education. And for me, it's child welfare. Those are the areas that are my priorities and have been pretty much the priorities on the Joint Budget Committee. We've got to get all the rest of our legislators there as well. And I'll turn it over to Speaker McCluskey.
Yes, thank you. Madam Speaker, with these cuts looking likely, if not inevitable next year, do you worry about the sustainability of the new school funding formula?
Yeah, I thank you. And Senator Kirkmeyer, I appreciate you bringing up our property tax decisions. You're right. We haven't celebrated what was a significant protection for schools and all of that. I would emphasize that we did this year exactly what we need to do every year. And that is, look at the playing field, understand where our, what our ultimate challenges may be for the budget, and then adjust, move, and flex so that we can continue to fund our schools at the highest level possible. I would agree that I think we have a strong bipartisan group of legislators that really put public school funding at the top of their list. That is a really good thing. But in a moment where we've had a $1.2 billion deficit, it does mean more than just belt tightening. I think that as we have seen the pressures from Medicaid expenditures that have far exceeded what our forecasts have been, the pressures that have come in the budget on our safety net. We will need to continue to evaluate what those trade-offs are, that prioritization process that Senator Kirkmeyer spoke to. I believe that we can be sustainable in how we have evaluated and looked at modeling for the next few years. The steps we took this year, again, the 7-year runway, the 15% adjustment on how much we're putting toward the formula. I believe that we are on a path to be sustainable with the new plan.
And now I want to hear from all our panelists on this next question. We cannot have a conversation about school funding in Colorado without bringing up the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, of course, Tabor. This is the breezy portion of the segment this evening. And so Tabor, of course, is the structure that limits government spending increases at the rate of inflation plus population growth. Tabor is at the center of a lawsuit right now with Democrats suing the state in an attempt to dismantle Tabor. Again, I want to hear from each of you. How much is Tabor responsible for the chronic underfunding of public schools in Colorado? And I will let anyone jump right in.
I'll jump in. I would offer a small correction, Erica. The Democrats have not yet engaged in a lawsuit over Tabor. There is a resolution that I believe is moving through the chambers for members to vote on and decide whether or not to pursue that lawsuit, just to be clear.
My apologies. Thank you for that correction.
No, and it's just so that people understand the process we're going through.
Thank you.
You know, one of the things I've commented on with Tabor is that I'm not sure our spending cap is set with the right metrics, that population growth and inflation are two things that should be considered for government growth. But a dynamic we saw this year, the Medicaid expenditure increase was largely due to us being an older, grayer Colorado. Long-term care services for our seniors grew at just very dramatic rates. That put new pressures on the budget. And so when we look at the Tabor cap, when it's only population growth and not the changing demographics of that population and the changing needs of that population, we're out of sync, right? Inflation is projected to be, I'm sure Senator Kirkmeyer knows better than I, but was projected to be under 3% or around 3%. Seeing that, and then we've got all of these increased pressures and costs, say, just in our healthcare system that far exceeded inflationary growth. Again, we're not adjusting based on some of those impacts. And I would say, you know, our voters love being able to decide whether there's going to be a tax increase or not. I certainly hear that in my district. Our school districts have been going to voters for, you know, I started working in public schools in the early 2000s, and my community has gone 5 separate times to voters to ask for additional mill levy overrides to be able to fund, whether it's teachers or technology or full free day kindergarten. We were one of the first in the state to do that with mill levy dollars. You know, that has been a tool that we have used in order to fund our public education system. So it's a balance, right? How do we work within the confines of Tabor or consider changes to that spending cap to be able to meet the needs, meet the demands that we are hearing from our public?
I'd love to hear from one of our district executives on this question. How much do you believe that Tabor is responsible for the underfunding of public schools in Colorado?
Chuck, you want to go first?
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, government, whether you like big government or small government, you should be willing to pay for what you want. And so I think it's very reasonable for people to have a perspective that says, you know, if we're going to raise taxes, we should at least have some say in that. And so I understand that. I do think that there should be some acknowledgement that there are also consequences of that. And that you have, you know, certainly in the Front Range, there are districts with a lot of property wealth and a lot of business wealth that have been able to, you know, essentially raise taxes less on their citizens and provide better services. And it would create a huge tax burden in some of the places, including where Kate works, to say build $100 million high school, whereas in some places like Denver and Boulder, it's not as hard. And so I think the pushing all this stuff to a local conversation has had, has had unintended consequences. And then there's certainly some technical problems with Tabor that has sort of ratcheted down government spending over time. And Speaker McCluskey sort of pointed to that. But I think there are future. We solved one issue with the school finance task force. There are other issues. I think interdistrict equity, property values across districts are other things to consider. And what is the right amount to spend, which Tabor has a part in, are future questions for future leaders in education.
I agree with everything that Chuck shared, and I'll just add one more layer, which is sure, Tabor is a structural issue that throttles revenue growth, and that's a sort of de facto part of Colorado's structure. But I also want to lift up that as a state, we've also said yes to other programs and initiatives, even in the area of education, that I think are exacerbating this. They were very well intentioned, right? I look at Free Meals for All. That is an amazing program. I've heard we have 100% of districts participating in that, and we know that the tax revenue coming in isn't sufficient to totally pay for the program. So, in 2018, I used to call the food service fund a giant sucking sound, and that's when we were putting $50,000 into it, and now we're putting $300,000 into it to fill that gap. So again, I think that Senator Kirkmeyer talked about priorities. I think as a state, voters have made decisions that maybe were made in isolation for really good things that have now resulted in these kind of compounding factors on top of Tabor.
Thank you, Kate. Senator Kirkmeyer, do you have any thoughts as well about how much Tabor is responsible for the chronic underfunding of Colorado schools?
I don't think it's a Tabor issue.
Okay.
I think it's
elaborate.
Yeah, I don't think it's a Tabor issue. I think it's a priority issue. I mean, so I served as a county commissioner, and in the county I was in, Weld County, we've had basically limits on spending and revenue coming in since 1976. And we were able to manage within that. I mean, Tabor's been around for 30 years. It's been a part of our system. I mean, to me, it's just another accounting type deal that we have to, regulation or whatever you want to look at, that we have to deal with, and we need to deal with it. I think the issue has been prioritization. What do you want to fund? What are your priorities? And then how do we fund those things? I will just give you an example, just even this year alone. We needed to cut our funding. Like, we should not be funding more than inflation. Inflation is at 2.4, 2.5%, yet our general fund spending is at 3.6% increase across the board. We can't keep doing that. Over the last 6 years, total revenue coming in and adjusted for inflation was 11.3%. Yet we have departments that are at 200% increase in their spending over the last 6 years, or 84%, or 39%. You cannot continue overspending. Like I said, I've mentioned this several times, but it's a crisis of priority. Do you want to fund animal welfare, or do you want to fund child welfare? I'm for child welfare. Do you want to fund education, or do you want to fund something else over in another department and create a new office? I'm for funding education. I'll give you an example of a new state department that we stood up, early childhood. We passed Proposition EE, said we were going to fund an additional 10 hours. We started off with the Colorado preschool program, which in 2022, we were funding it at approximately about $176 million. We had about 36,000 children involved in that, and they were in the public school system, right? It wasn't even including the private school system. We now are funding about $350 million to early, universal preschool. And we only have about, I say only, but we have about 48,000 children involved in preschool, which includes both private and public sector now. And so we more than doubled it, but we didn't more than double the kids. And I ask, early childhood department, what the heck is going on? You've more than doubled the amount of money, but we haven't doubled the amount of kids. What's going on? And why isn't this sufficient? I mean, we've got about $146 million parked over there in early childhood, but we didn't double the number of kids. And it's like, okay, priorities. What's going on in this department? Why aren't we funding more children? Why isn't it working? Why are we now talking that we may have to cut back on number of hours? Doesn't make sense to me at all. We've created a new department. We've created new offices. We created the Behavioral Health Administration. It's like maybe we should have been thinking about how we fund education, how we fund our Medicaid providers. We've done expansion in the Medicaid provider, in the Medicaid realm of the number of people that are being eligible for Medicaid. I mean, there's all sorts of things that are happening that we need to, as a state, as a General Assembly, as the people who write the budget, we need to set what our priorities are and fund them. As I said to all of the departments this year, there are 20 departments in state government. It's 2 departments that make up about 68, 69% of our general fund operating. And that's what we're talking about. I mean, people get confused because we talk about, we have a $44 billion budget. Well, that includes federal funds. It includes cash funds. We need to talk about what we're talking about when we say a $1.2 billion shortfall is that's in our general fund operating budget. That's about an $18.5 billion budget this year. So that's where we're trying to make up this money. So we have 18 departments that make up, about 1/3 of our general fund operating expenditure. As I explained to all of them this year several times, if they all were to cut 10%, we would have been halfway there, right? But they couldn't even figure out where to cut 10%. Instead, overall, we increased by more than inflation this year. That's why next year is going to be more difficult. I mean, we were trying to do, a smooth landing this year. And I said, well, we still landed the plane in the Hudson River. It's like, but we at least started, our way there, and we were able to balance our budget this year. But again, it goes back to setting what are your priorities. Are all those new offices really that important? Are all those new little programs really that important? Or do we need to get back to funding what we should be funding? I mean, again, I worked as a county commissioner. We were able to not only balance our budget as required. I mean, we all have balanced budget requirements in this state, whether you're local government or state government. We're not only balance our budget, but we were able to cut our mill levy. I worked for a governor in his cabinet, and we were required every year to make cuts. It didn't matter. And it was at the Department of Local Affairs, which is one of our smaller departments, especially when it comes to general fund operating dollars. We were still required to cut. I mean, my first year there, we were required to cut 16%. Like, you have to go find it. Where are the priorities? It doesn't matter if you're a small department, you still have to make cuts. It doesn't matter if you're the judicial branch, you still have to make cuts. So everybody has to come up with cuts, and that's where we're going to be next year.
Well, I want to shift the conversation from where we are right now to where some say that we need to go. As I mentioned earlier, these 2 adequacy studies that were ordered by the legislature, results were released earlier this year indicating that Colorado needs to put an additional $3.5 billion to $4.1 billion into schools in order to adequately fund them based on current student needs. I want to start with you, Senator Kirkmeyer. Do you believe that we need to ramp up school funding in Colorado long-term to add an additional $3.5 billion to $4.1 billion to education? And if so, is there a realistic path to get there over time?
I don't know how we ramp up to get to $3 to $4 billion increase in funding education. My goal has been to make sure that we follow and fully fund education as required under the Constitution, and that we can provide for the inflationary increases. I mean, over the course of my term being a state senator, working with Senator Zenzinger, we were able to increase a lot of funding with regard to special education funding. So do I think we can get ramped up to 3 or 4 billion more in the next few years? No, I just don't see how we get there. But as I said earlier, what I tell Senator Lundeen and what I'm telling Speaker McCluskey, my job is if whether it's 1448 or 1320, My job is to figure out how we fully fund current law. That's what we do at the Joint Budget Committee. And I am committed to that, to ensuring that we have that funding in place and that we set that as a priority. So, under the Constitution, we're required to fund a free public school system. It's not the only thing we're required to fund, but we are required to fund that. And also under the Constitution, we're required to increase that by inflation. That will be my goal, being a state senator, sitting on the Joint Budget Committee, is that we meet that funding. If we can ramp up funding more, believe me, I am all in, just like I was with special education, just like I was last year when we needed to find additional funding for the, immigration children that were coming into our school systems and ensuring that, we were dealing with that impact as best we could. I mean, we put an additional $24 million into that. So that's my job, and that's what I'm going to do. Will we get to 3 or 4 billion? I don't know how we get there without some pretty creative budgeting and with some major cuts or something else coming into the system. But we can't blame that on Tabor. We just have to figure out how we fund education. That's it.
What do you say to the adequacy study results, House Speaker McCluskey? Do you believe there's a realistic way to ramp up funding over time to add $3 to $4 billion more to school funding?
Yeah, when in 2018, I was not yet elected, but the Interim School Finance Committee had met and considered a superintendent's bill. And it had wide bipartisan, wide school district support. I don't remember how folks were lining up here in the building, but that bill called for an additional $1 billion in funding. And I remember even then, it was a daunting conversation, right? When we talk about 1 billion or 3.5 or 4 billion, I think if nothing else, it does help us appreciate what the budget stabilization factor has done to our overall public funding education system and model, and that we are behind. I will tell you that those adequacy studies just came out this January, February. And while I've had a chance to read them, I have not had a chance to engage with our broad coalition of education leaders, whether you're talking about superintendents and principals, you're talking about school board members, you're talking about teachers and families, students, right? All of us who want to make sure that we have a world-class public education system. We have tools in the state currently. We can bring measures to our public to vote, to give them the choice on how we address funding shortfalls at the local or state level. I think it's worth a very broad and even grassroots conversations in communities across this state. If this is a priority for us, I believe it is. I echo Senator Kirkmeyer's sentiment that we need to prioritize public school funding. If that is true, and I believe it to be, then we need to also help craft a path on how we drive more funding to public schools in the state, to higher education. I'm going to throw higher education in the mix here as well. It's the entire preschool through college degree experience that we need to make future investments in. And while I don't have an immediate answer, I want to be a part of the process and a part of the willingness to try and find a path forward.
And now to that point, we are beginning to see some momentum build behind potentially running a state ballot measure in 2026 through a campaign among education advocates called the Get It Done campaign. These organizations really want lawmakers to begin looking at what it would take to close the gap between what we're pouring into education now and how we would get to $3.5 to $4.1 billion more. Now, Colorado voters have repeatedly rejected initiatives that would raise revenue for schools. That's just been part of Colorado's history. And so, Kate and Chuck, I want to hear from you with this next question. What do you believe it would take for a state ballot measure aimed at raising revenue for schools to be successful? How do we communicate to taxpayers why schools need more money and what this money would effectively be used for?
I can
Kate,
take
why
a
don't we
stab
hear
at
from you
it.
first?
Okay, great. Yeah. I think it's all about stories. I think that we need to help people understand both the good work that we're doing in our schools and also the challenges that we face. When I tell people that the kiddos in our 3rd to 6th grade school can't drink the water in their school, that really gets people's attention. And when I explain that of the mental health professionals we have in our district right now, only one of them is funded by the general fund, and all of the rest of them are funded by grants, which means that they're on a timeline to not having funding for their positions. So in my mind, that is the key strategy. But I really do want to emphasize the first part of what I said. We also have to make the case for our value proposition. We can't just, talk about the woe is me, the fact that here I am in my office, which is a former kindergarten classroom, and I can tell you all the things that are wrong with it. We need to talk about the powerful outcomes that we're generating for kids, the pathways that we're providing for them, both to college and to career. We've got to talk about amazing early childhood programs that we're funding through braided funding sources to give kids a leg up and a tailwind. We've got to talk about the adoption of rigorous standards-aligned curriculum and the way we see that moving our literacy growth in the right direction. So I think it's stories on both ends of the spectrum, both celebrations and challenges.
Thank you, Kate. Chuck, what do you believe it will take to pass a successful measure in Colorado raising revenue for schools? How do we communicate to taxpayers the gravity of getting more school funding?
Well, I think everybody can share their like perspective as a citizen. I think for me, like, we have a very clear job, and it's about taking kids who are put in our care and graduating them with the skills they need to be an effective citizen. And so it starts with that value proposition, and it needs to be something real for parents and for people in Colorado, that this is going to make their life better. Their kids are going to be in school longer. Their teachers are going to get paid more. Maybe there's less kids in their class. Maybe there's more mental health, but it has to be something real. And it has to be something clear, because if you're going to say, hey, open your wallet for this, like, it has to really matter. And we have to, and it will be an enormous failure if the system isn't better after we put more money into it, meaning more kids graduate, more kids are better prepared. So we can't just pay more for the same thing. And so I would say, if you can make that case, and I think you can, I think Coloradans are generous and they want to support this stuff, but you have to be accountable that the system will be better after you do that. And I think people are up to that, but that's the case that has to be made.
Thank you, Chuck. I want to close out our conversation by touching on one trend that we're seeing ripple across Colorado school districts and across the country. Declining enrollment is becoming a top of mind issue for many districts in this state. Of course, that has serious funding implications down the road, because at a very base level, our school funding formula gives districts money for every student that they educate. So districts experiencing declining enrollment are potentially more likely to see funding losses, although of course we know our averaging tool cushions them from seeing funding losses. To wrap things up, what does the state need to do? What do school districts need to do to start adjusting our school systems for this trend of declining enrollment, which does not look like it will be going away over the next several years? And I'd welcome anyone to jump in.
Last year in our school finance formula proposal, we included a study to be completed about declining student enrollment. We're seeing this all across the nation. I think there are some really creative and innovative responses that states are coming up with. We've talked about here, as an example, it costs the same amount of money to run a school bus, whether you have one student on that bus or 30 students, right? And so there are some basic costs of operating a school district that we may never be able to get away from. But we've got to be more creative in maybe sharing resources between districts, particularly in smaller rural settings, trying to find out how we can support school districts in preparing for that ongoing loss of enrollment, so that they are taking measures early and often. You know, some of our school districts simply don't have a playbook. What do we do when we suddenly lose 500 students? And we've seen in Jeffco, for example, they ended up closing 16 schools in just 1 year because they had put off some of those cost containment measures or cost cutting measures for a while, trying to hold out. And the student, population did not return, did not increase. So I do think I had pulled a bill title this year to examine this issue. We ended up parking that on the side. I hope to pick it up again because I think we're going to have to work together across interest groups and certainly with our local partners in figuring out a better and more sustainable path forward.
Thank you very much. And that is our hour. I don't know about you guys, but it went way too fast for me. I think we could stay here for another 4 hours, but I know work at the Capitol cannot be ignored. I want to thank our panelists, House Speaker McCluskey, Senator Kirkmeyer, Chuck, and Kate for taking time this evening to really bring us inside schools, bring us to the state perspective level to talk about this really important issue of school funding. Thank you very much to our audience members for tuning in, and thank you to our event sponsor, the Colorado Education Association. This is one of many conversations to come, and we hope to see you at our next event.
Thank you.